Welcome back to another episode of the Experts in Fire podcast. I'm your host, Mike Vennard, and with me today is Randy Mowry. Today's episode is DIY fire pits, construction, guidelines, and essentials. Let's get into it. Hey Randy, how you doing today, brother?
I'm doing great. How you doing today, Mike?
It's turning fall, man. I'm literally looking out the window, and there are lots of green, and then there's some reds and yellows. My favorite time, man. Favorite time of year.
And it's just not the leaves, it's the weather too, where we can use fire.
That's just it, man. During the hot July and in some of August, it's like, okay, fire's nice, but when you're sitting there swatting skeeters and sweating, like that's what my wife will say. She's like, I'm just sitting here sweating. I'm going inside. I can't argue with her, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So, Randy, today we are going to talk about DIY fire pits, construction guidelines, and essentials. And I want to make sure right off the bat here, we help people understand what we mean by DIY, because when you hear DIY, you think, hi, I'm a homeowner and I'm running around with a sledgehammer, because we see it on TV all the time. And our definition of DIY is definitely different than that.
I agree with you there 100%.
So, when we say DIY, there is a section of, and this is for all of our listeners out there, especially our pros, there is this ability that everyone has to build their own fire pit. And especially as we talk about this, we talk with our hardscapers and landscapers, and man, I follow a bunch of them on Instagram. It's just fun to watch the creations that they make. So talented, man. But then all of a sudden you see a fire pit right in the middle, and it's built out of the same stone. It's got a gorgeous capstone on it, and it's either wood burning or gas burning. And so what we would call a DIY fire pit would be that gas burning fire pit where they've made their own stone, put a capstone on there, and there is a pan, a burner of some sort inside connected to a gas source.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what this is going to be geared towards, is we're gearing towards really the gas fire pits that have become so popular over the years. And like you said, I do the same thing, on Instagram and all these different social medias, my LinkedIn account, I follow tons of folks there. And we see it all the time as far as all of these, and I like to use the word site-built fire pits. What we're going to discuss today at DIY is we're going to discuss kind of like the things to look for, the equipment that is needed and or, you want to use for the fire pit. But these are like site-built from essentially the kind of the ground up type of fire pit, not a turnkey fire pit like we also offer, meaning just you're going to buy a fire bowl, it's going to deliver on a pallet, you're going to set it in place, and, in that. No, these are site-built from the ground up, Mike.
I love it. That's a great way to put it. It's something that you've built from the ground up, but you need the components too. And we'll kind of work through a checklist here. So if you're listening out there, get pen and paper out or take some notes digitally if that's how you prefer. But we'll work through a checklist of things that you should be thinking about while you're putting your plan together. And I know we sit down with hardscape architects, and they're the ones that are actually sitting there putting the whole thing together, and it looks phenomenal. But as we talk to them, they're looking at us going, well, one of the hardest parts of my job is understanding the gas line that needs to come in. And that's where we help. You put it together, you draw your site-built fire pit in, and then talk with us, and we can work through what's going to fit in there, what burner and pan, all the things we're going to go through in your checklist today, so that from start to finish, expectations, and I'm big on that, right? And I know you are too. The expectations have been set properly, and everybody knows what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, the safety aspect of the whole thing, making sure this whole thing comes together safely for when it is being used, that it's being used not only properly, but, safely.
I love it. You have fire-related questions, and we have answers. You can email us your questions at podcast@woodlanddirect.com or give us a call at 586-221-3638. We would love to be able to answer them right here on the Experts in Fire podcast. All right, well, let's dive in. What's the first thing that someone should be thinking about when they're talking about a site-built fire pit?
So when it comes to the fire pits themselves, obviously location is going to be number one, and we want to recognize where it's going to go and decide where this thing's going regarding everything from what's overhead, any building structures around it. So that's going to be the very first thing itself, is where are we placing this thing?
It's such a big deal, and it isn't something you just want to think of later and go, oh, let's put a fire pit there. Because, I talk with these architects, and it's valuable for them to know you can't just set certain fire pits underneath a pergola and think, hey, that's okay. And ultimately it looks sweet. It looks great on paper, and then it looks sweet when you actually do it. But there isn't a single fire pit burner and pan manufacturer that I can think of that says, yeah, go ahead and put this under a pergola.
Correct. Yeah. The placement is so important because, like you said, a pergola made out of wood with a 8-foot ceiling versus something that maybe has a 12-foot ceiling out of aluminum or steel is completely different install. It's a different conversation of what they can or cannot use.
Exactly. So now, depending on where you want to locate that fire pit is going to determine what type of materials you can use if you are looking to use a pergola or something of that nature. So, I mean, we're on number one here, Randy, and I'm watching all the dominoes, man.
Right. So we're, running through this. This is a very generic, simple list of going through this site-built fire pit. And as we want our listeners to understand is this could get into something really deep and, rabbit trail really easy on the podcast. So we're going to try to keep it within a reasonable time here.
Agreed. So, I mean, location, we just brought a couple little rabbit trails out there in terms of location, but it is very valuable for someone to take a look at where do I want this to go, because fire is going to be a dictator of what you can do. And I think that's the best way we can put it, right?
Correct.
After location, we figured that out. What are we looking at next?
So location is within that location too. We want to, the surface itself, what is it going to sit on? Are we building this into an existing table, or is this going on a deck, a patio? So what are we setting the unit on itself? What are we building it on as far as the fire pit goes?
And so help me understand surface a little more, because I'm thinking in terms of, an architect and a hardscaper. So you're thinking, some type of non-combustible material, right?
Correct. Yeah, we just want to make sure that it's a flat, level surface that it's going onto. Like a concrete patio, for example. If it's a deck, what is that deck made out of? Because you want to make sure that the where the unit is going to sit is a non-combustible surface. As far as the build itself, non-combustible meaning is it a Trex deck? The product that you're using, is it applicable to use like on said Trex style deck? And this goes kind of our landscapers that are working on it at a home, for example, and the deck's already there and they're going to site build something. Maybe they're doing something out of stone. So we just want to make sure, because the radiant heat could transfer from the underside of that unit to that said deck. And that's going to kind of go back to the burner, the product, that are being used, Mike.
Yeah, that's a solid point, Randy, because most people, I think we all in our minds just go, well, heat rises, right? So it should be okay.
Yeah, we do, except for when you're using propane. Yeah, the natural gas is lighter than air and it's going to rise. Propane is heavier than air, and so that's going to have a tendency to possibly pool up underneath, whatever that fire pit is. And so with that being said, there again, we want to just make sure that we have no heat transfer to that deck itself below. One of the things that we don't want to do is, put it on something like for example, like the grass, unless it is done properly, meaning it's cut out, it's all tampered down and built solid as if somebody's building a brick paver. You want it to be structurally safe so that it doesn't sink and move around with the weather and the season, where it could impact the function and that becoming unsafe.
Excellent. All right. What is next on our checklist here?
So we're just talking, we're kind of in that location, surface area, the proximity of other area things. And this is kind of going to go back to the manufacturer of the burner system that's being used. And it's the proximity of what's around the fire pit. The clearance to combustibles is going to be important. And that's all going to be outlined in each manual, because it may vary based on the manufacturer. It may vary on the BTU of the fire pit burner that is being used. So you always want to refer to that manual for your clearance to combustibles, meaning around it, 360 degrees around it, and then above it, like you had mentioned previously, how much space do we need from the top of that burner to what is above for clearances.
Yeah, I know we have certain manufacturers who run tests all the time with, I don't want to call them rooms, but we get a lot of questions on, well, it's got like 2 walls or 3 walls, and then there's a ceiling up above, but it's 10 feet high, and they'll put their burners and pans in a space similar to that, in a controlled environment with fire suppression and everything there, and then they'll run their burner and see how long it takes for that to turn into a bad situation. Let's just say that. So, and I've gotten to walk through those and seen the charred walls and the burnt up ceilings and all those bad things that can happen. So they do all of that for their listing, right? For their testing. And then also to help people understand. And I'm asking them, man, can we get some of this on video? I'd like to be able to. And it's always, we don't want to deter people, but we want to educate people. So proximity does become very important, and especially the manufacturers, they know that, and they list it specifically in their manuals, what you can be near, what can be above, what can be to the sides, all those types of things. So
yeah, exactly. Kind of talking about that and the testing, it kind of moves us into just really the different fuel types, which are, propane and natural gas are going to be your 2 primary fuel types. And this is something you're always want to lean on that licensed gas plumber for whatever application you're doing. Whether you're hard piping that natural gas or you're hard piping that propane, more likely you've got permits. Your local jurisdiction is going to have certain codes that are going to have to be followed to do this. And then, when you get into something like propane, especially if somebody's trying to use a 20-pound propane tank, like the same size used for a barbecue grill, Mike, it's a whole different build at that point. Especially if they're looking to put the tank inside of the structure itself. The connections are going to be similar, meaning as far as your connections, you typically going to have some kind of key valve and flex lines going from said gas supply to the burners, which we can get into a little bit as we get into the controls. Those primary 2 differences are just going to be your propane and your natural gas.
And so let's hover there for just a second, Randy. When it comes to gas, and we're going to go through on the checklist here more things that you need to consider. When you're talking natural gas and propane, typically in a site-built fire pit, you're going to hard pipe that into either a pig if it's using propane or your natural gas connection. And we talk about this quite often, but I want to mention it again while we're here. Understanding and knowing the number of BTUs that are going to flow through the burner that you want to put into place is very important. It's very important.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important, if applicable, that Woodland Direct, that we get in on the front end of a project so that we can assist with that. The most challenging thing is I do a lot of commercial properties, multifamily and things like that, is when those gas lines are already ran, Mike, and the expectation from the designer, the property owner is A, and then we get to the BTU of what they want to do, and we have to step down to B because of what they have available BTU wise. They may be looking at something that requires 500,000 BTUs. Then we find out it's already been piped, and when we get a calculation on what they have available BTU wise, we only have like 100,000 BTUs. And I'm just using extreme numbers here to illustrate a difference. But it's happened before, unfortunately. So anytime we can be on the front end, kind of going back to your point about the BTUs, is way more beneficial to the design and what they're expecting on the front end of a job. Now, not to say that if it's already done, as long as we can get the BTU, we'll find something that will make it work and look aesthetically pleasing. It's not to say that we can't. It is just, it's always nice to be on the front end, because it is important. And that doesn't matter whether it's a lot of my properties down in the Florida area, for example, that are using nothing but propane, or Colorado, they have a lot of propane out there. So these resorts and hotels are using propane. So it's the same thing, whether it's propane or natural gas. It's important to have that ability to provide that information in the front end. And I mentioned like the 20-pound tanks because I do have some ski resorts that maybe want to put fire features at the bottom of the mountains, and they can't run an actual hard pipe, but they are site building fire pits and they use small tanks. So, that's like a different build, a different design that has to be met in order to use the smaller tanks. There's always a site build that can happen. It's just making sure it happens correctly, that's all.
Absolutely. I agree. And it's an important piece on the checklist, though, because you do want to know what kind of gas pressure can I get out there? What are the demands going to be coming from that burner in terms of BTUs, so that you can prep beforehand? Or if it already exists, then you're in the position of, okay, then what's a solution for the gas type that I have and the pressure that I have coming through? Big important piece to the puzzle right there. As I said earlier, as the dominoes begin to fall, you can see there's a lot of little things that you need to be aware of and that you need to know. I'm going to throw in right there, because I don't think we had it in the rest of what we were talking about. One of the other things you're going to want to know when you're thinking gas type is also ignition type. And we're going to talk about ignition later. The only reason I bring it up right now, though, is because before you lay a paver down, you're going to want to know if you're using an electronic ignition.
Yes, yeah, electricity or not. Yeah, good point. Absolutely.
So in that, I'm gonna put that. I'm taking notes here too, Randy. I'm gonna put that here too, because this is a good time to understand. Boy, I need to make a decision on ignition to know if we're gonna run that gas line, and then in a different trench, I'm running my electric line as well. And I say in a different trench because I've done this stuff before, and I already know. Don't think you can run them in the same trench, guys. All right, so where do we go next? We know we have gas. We got propane and natural gas, and we need to figure out what our pressures are. So where do we go now?
So, within the design, I'm gonna go to like the enclosure styles first, as far as what you're building the site built fire pit out of, because this could be a number of things when you're site building a fire pit. Most of the time you're seeing, like, if somebody's doing landscape, they've got the hardscapers out there doing stone patios or retaining walls and things of that nature. They may build the fire pit out of that same material, whatever it's round, rectangle, square, whatever the design is, or if it's a fire pit table that they're going to put a countertop on. So it could be any number of types of stones. You have also ready to finish structures, and those structures are going to be like hardy board, metal stud that's glued and screwed and hardy back, and that arrives on site, and then the landscapers finish the build with the material that they're going to use on it, maybe a smaller stone and that type of thing. And then or they'll site build it out of the same materials, Mike. They'll just build the structure on site out of hardy board, metal stud, hardy board it, and then put some type of stone, marble, granite top, whatever they're going to use, as far, limestone, capstone. So it all goes back to the design itself. And then I've had some that do a kind of a pour in place style of concrete on site, especially when they're doing some of these bigger commercial jobs. They've got the concrete guys out there already, and so they're just forming it up and they're pouring in place. So those are kind of the enclosure styles for the most part when you're site building the units themselves. And I started there because the important part of, especially when you're doing stuff like pour in place or stone concrete, is it kind of moves us into the next one, which is ventilation for these fire pits. Ventilation is very, very important when doing, whether you're doing natural gas or propane, because it provides fresh air, one, for the ignition system, keeping the ignition, if you're doing electronic, like you alluded to earlier, is just if we're doing electronic ignition system. But more importantly, from the safety part of it, it's a continuous airflow for drainage and for prevents gas and heat from building up inside of that fire pit enclosure. I don't want to go to the extreme, but without airflow on the safety part of it, as far as airflow displacing and moving gas through that enclosure, if the gas builds up in said fire pit, something could happen there. If there's a spark or a flame below, we could have some major problems there from a safety aspect.
We call them combustion events, uncontrolled combustion events.
Yes.
Yeah, so it is, and I think, Randy, I'm so glad you did it that way, enclosures to ventilation, because it's one of the first things I look at if I'm scrolling any social media, and you've got this beautiful new patio, and then all of a sudden there's a fire pit, and I'm looking around it. I'm looking to see if there's no ventilation there. I don't want to say warning, Will Robinson or anything of that nature, because that definitely dated me. But I do want to say you need to add that to your understanding of what you're building. And that's what I've noticed. A lot of guys have taken that step to say, people want fire pits, I'm going to give them a fire pit. Good on you. Great job. That's a great business choice, right? It's a great way to grow your business. But let us help you, educate you to understand you need airflow. And we get it. Some people look at us and go, I don't want a big stainless steel things on there that grates, they look terrible. Be creative. There are ways to, we work with so many contractors who leave gaps when they're building the inside structure, or they'll use plugs if they're pouring it, and then they'll use their stone just to kind of make a grate itself. But you need air to move through the underneath of that thing so that it can push gases out of there, really alleviate any stress and strain. I like the way you put it as well, alleviate any stress you might have on the ignition system if you do have an electronic ignition system. Think of it this way. If you close the lid on your barbecue grill and the flames go out and it's just pouring gas in there, you're not going to just push you shouldn't.
You're right.
Maybe you do, but you shouldn't just push the button to reignite, because it's going to blow the lid off. It's an uncontrolled combustion event. So you need to open it and let some air through there and let it move around. So that's a great point there, Randy. I love the way you brought that together for us. Thank you.
No, absolutely, because it's so important. And just to touch on, when they're building these fire pits, depending on the size, this ventilation is going to vary a little bit based on the burners, but good rule of thumb is vents on opposing sides, so you've got that cross ventilation. So at least two, typically they're 18 square inches. Like, just think in terms of like a 3-inch by 6-inch vent. And like you said, those vents can be built out of different things as long as there's a hole there. You can saw cut your stack stone or stone and create that louver look versus using a stainless steel, vent. There's a number of different things that can be used aesthetically, but the ventilation is definitely very, very important.